So Rob, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into the future, can you tell us a little bit about your own background? Where did you grow up?
Dr. Nick, with the greatest of pleasure. I grew up largely around a little KwaZulu-Natal Midlands town of Moy River. My father farmed until my mother passed away. My mother passed away when I was 12, and then my father became an animal health inspector with the government. And I lived in and around the town of Moy River pretty much all of my upbringing, and I now live in the Midlands town of Howick. So KwaZulu-Natal Midlands is very much my place, and certainly the area I call home.
And Rob, what was your dream career when you grew up?
My dream career growing up, Dr. Nick, was to become a vet. Unfortunately, I never achieved the grades required at school to become a vet, and having done a BSc degree in agriculture, I couldn't face another 4 or 5 years to do the BSc veterinary, which one could do having done my first degree. But my dream career growing up was to become a vet. I've always had a deep empathy and love of animals and wildlife, livestock as well. And it was a great sadness for me not achieving the grades to get into Onderstepoort, which is really quite steep. The requirements to get in there are very high indeed.
And tell us, Rob, what is your favorite animal?
My favorite animal now that I'm older is probably the leopard. I have got a deep fascination and love of leopards. I also love buffalo, strangely, but I would say that my favorite animal, if one was to ask me for a single answer, would be the leopard.
Well, that's obviously the royal emblem for the Zulu kingdom. And I assume for a number of other kingdoms around the world. So Rob, you're having an illustrious career. You've been presenting all over the world. You were introduced to the Hall of Fame of Speakers last year. You joined the you joined the Arctic and Antarctic expedition every single year for the last 7-8 years. Who inspired you in your early days?
Well, I was inspired very much in my early days by, firstly, my father. My father was very influential and inspirational in my life. And I also had a fantastic teacher and athletics coach at high school called Charlie Brown, who sadly passed away a few years ago of cancer. But he was a deep thinker and a man who had a great influence on my life, not just academically, but particularly on the sports field. I was very involved with athletics and did athletics at quite a high level. And Charlie Brown, along with my father, they were very similar human beings. I would say were very inspirational figures and great mentors to me growing up.
And Rob, I believe you started your career as a photographer and a tour guide. Is that right?
I did. I studied agriculture at university, but for various reasons, I really wanted some time alone to address cracks that had appeared in my soul after the death of my father, which took place when I was at university. And I went off to work in Botswana as a photographic safari guide. And it very quickly became apparent that I was enjoying the photography probably more than I was enjoying the pure guiding and the human aspect of that work. So I then began to work with National Geographic and a man called Tim Liversidge, who was doing wildlife documentaries in the Okavango Delta, and spent 3 very happy years largely working as a photographer and assisting with filmmaking in the Okavango Delta with Tim Liversidge and his wildlife productions for National Geographic.
And I believe this is how you got in touch with Kingsley Holgate, the famous...
well, that's a wonderful story in its own right. Absolutely. Kingsley Holgate was testing equipment for their proposed trip from Cape Town to Cairo across Africa. And they wanted to spend some time on the Okavango Delta. and I had some free time to guide them around in the area that I was familiar with. And then they wanted to do a trip out westwards to what is called the Tsadula Hills, the famous burial site and very important ancestral site for the San or the Bushman people. And we went out there for a few days, and it was an incredible time, and I got on extremely well with him and his wife Jill and their son Ross and the other expedition members. And they invited me to join them on this incredible odyssey, the African Odyssey, from Cape Town to Cairo, which took place in 1993.
And Rob, what would you say was a turning point in your career?
Well, Dr. Nick, I've thought about that often in my life in terms of my background and where I am today. And the turning point in my career really came in my mid-30s, where I was bumbling along, earning a living, but not really earning enough to make much progress. I felt I was working as a photographic safari guide and taking people on wildlife expeditions, horse riding trips up Sani Pass, fly fishing, bird watching, that sort of thing. And then in the quiet time, in the winter time, I was looking after dairy farms. When farmers went away, I would take care of their farms and their dairies, what we in this province call farm sitting. But I didn't really see much of a future doing that. And then quite by chance, a fellow who was at university with me and used to listen to the stories I told at university had become curator of the Rorke's Museum. And he, in a strange twist of fate, recommended me to David Rattray, who was the doyen of the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields, and thought that I might be suitable for the telling of the stories on the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields. So with no background in theatre, drama, public speaking, or history, David Rattray invited me to join him telling stories at his St. Luana and Rorke's Drift, along with the other battlefields. And that really, at age 35, was the turning point, certainly in my career.
And Rob, you've been telling the stories of Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift, and the Arctic expeditions now for, I believe, 20 years. Can you tell us, what is the power of storytelling today?
Well, Dr. Nick, that is a wonderful question. I think that innately as human beings, we have a deep desire to listen to a story and be entertained in the theater of our own imagination. And I think that that tendency has increased with the plethora and the overload of entertainment options that we have available with the internet, with 3D theaters, with everything that is available in terms of entertainment to us. I think that as human beings, we deeply desire to go back to a point where we are told a story, and it's a bit like going back to being a child and being read a story at bedtime or being told a story by your parents before you go to sleep. And I think the power of storytelling is probably more pertinent and more powerful today than it has ever been. Certainly messages are better conveyed in the business place if they are couched or enclosed in a story. More and more leaders, more and more business captains are wanting to master the art of storytelling in terms of getting their messages and their culture across to their colleagues and their teams and their businesses. So I'm in a very, very blessed position now of making a living out of storytelling, and I think enjoying the crest of the wave where storytelling, in terms of its popularity, its appeal, and its pertinence in our modern day life, really is at an all-time high.
And tell us, Rob, I've heard you tell the story of Isandlwana, the Battle of Isandlwana, many times in a very capturing way. What is it that draws audiences from all over the world to this battlefield, to a battle that happened 150 years, almost 150 years ago? What would you say is the relevance of Isandlwana today?
Well, look, I think what really appeals to the visitors who come to Isandlwana is the fact that the battlefield itself has changed very little over the past 141 years. The canvas on which we paint that story as a result is quite mesmerizing, beguiling, and beautiful. And for many visitors, there is tremendous lesson to come out of this epic battle that took place between the Zulus and the Brits all those years ago. And I think that there's something that appeals to the romantic within our beings about a Zulu who was practically naked, armed with a stick and a shield, and his raw Zulu courage, defending his homeland, his family, his hunting grounds, his cattle herds, against this invading British army armed with modern Martini Henry rifles. And somewhere in it all, people want to sit down and be carried along by the tumult and this incredibly credible story, I hope well told. And the fact that 20,000 visitors a year come to Isandlwana, which is a remote place from all over the world, must attest to the appeal of the story and the experience to human beings today.
And Rob, tell us, what is driving you today?
I'm being driven today, Dr. Nick. It's interesting as we get older and we begin to analyze our lives. I'm being driven today by trying to achieve a life with purpose, and certainly purpose through the work that I'm doing. And I would like, through the power of my storytelling and the authenticity of what I do, to positively influence the way people think, the way they lead their lives, and the way they approach the future. So I'm really being driven today by trying to improve my offerings, improve my storytelling, improve myself as a human being, and live a life with purpose, and to carry that purpose through by virtue of this very privileged vocation in telling stories to groups of people, and hopefully in so doing, positively impact on their lives.
Now, Rob, a lot of your stories, if not all your stories, are stories about leadership, if I'm right. And so I know it's a big question, but what does the future of leadership mean to you?
Well, the future of leadership to me really means that folks need to achieve purpose in life that needs to be clear to those who know them or those who want to interact with them. And I think that very, very importantly, we need to achieve a level of integrity, of trust, of authenticity, and most importantly, we need folks, hopefully, who aspire to our leadership to like us. And I think that people will follow and be led by the folks that they like. And that is a difficult thing to achieve. But I think most importantly, in terms of the future of leadership, it's very important to me to be filled with integrity and to lead a life that is authentic and trustworthy, and set that example in everything that I do to those who may aspire to my level of leadership, and certainly to the future of leadership. I believe that's crucial.
Now, Rob, looking back over your own journey, what have you learned? What would you say are the qualities that are most important for building future leaders?
Well, I think that what is very, very important for me is establishing unquestioned authenticity and credibility as a human being and as a leader. And I think that it's very important for folks not to be swept along by the notion of overnight successes, quick fixes, a quick buck, and they have to be careful about the instant gratification that so many folks are looking for in the world today, because leadership is different in different genres, in different people, and certainly is a trait that many folks are looking for. And leaders have got a great responsibility in terms of the way they live their life and interact with others, in terms of getting folks to follow their leadership style and their leadership platform. And I think about this all the time. And I think that most importantly in it all is a degree of integrity, authenticity, trust, and as I said earlier, that folks hopefully respect you and like you, and in so doing will be inclined to be led by you.
Now, Rob, when you speak to upcoming leaders, what is it you tell them about social media? How should they navigate and handle social media to build their own leadership brand?
Dr. Nick, my recommendation to folks always is a systemic or systematic approach. I think that trying to develop a vast number of followers or friends or connections overnight is a very difficult thing. I think it's important to try and get folks who know you, respect you, and like you to offer recommendations and referrals, and to recommend you to others in terms of building up that following. And I think that it is far more important to have an authentic, integral following of a lesser number than a vast following like some of the pop stars or rock stars have, of folks who may have heard them on a YouTube video, but nothing more. So for me, it's very important to be giving out a consistent message to folks who would potentially follow us, and try and so doing to systematically build up that following, that core through the recommendations and referrals of folks who know us and trust us. And most importantly is getting back to those core values that people can like, respect, and trust.
Right. And Rob, we've all had our ups and downs in our careers and our lives. What is your advice to future leaders? What are the kind of challenges they should expect in their career? And maybe what are the challenges that you have expected or that you have encountered?
I think that one of the major challenges is the transience of modern life, where folks can switch their allegiance and their following literally instantaneously to something or someone else. Folks are really after instant gratification, and there is this challenge where folks want success immediately. And I think that for future leaders, that is very, very challenging. Folks need to maintain their core interest and their core ideas, and in so doing, build up a following and a support network that are going to be with them through thick and thin. For me, the biggest challenges these days is the transient, temporary nature of so much of the modern world.
And Rob, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are some of the new skills that you would want to factor in?
Well, I would say that one of the very important new skills, given the incidence of social media in the world today, is learning how to interact on a personal basis with those around you, to develop and nurture your interpersonal skills, and particularly your ability to speak with other folk. Not necessarily public speaking, but just being able to speak on the phone and to speak on an online webinar or forum with people that you come across in a convincing, engaging, authentic, and trustworthy manner. And very importantly, I always want to say to the folks who are kind enough to give me an ear, that they need to take care of business, the business that they have chosen to engage in, and be very careful of the modern tendency of credit. I'm always encouraging people to live within their means. So whether it's on a financial basis or an emotional basis or a spiritual basis, to live within your means, to remain true to your core calling, and certainly to develop interpersonal skills that folks want to and are inclined to engage with you.
Now, Rob, you are speaking to many schools, and I know you're doing a lot of pro bono work. As a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
Well, Dr. Nick, I've got a wonderful story about a delightful Zulu gentleman called Joseph Ndima. Joseph was part of a mentorship scheme that took place up at Rooksdrift, and we identified that he was probably one of the better male students within that course, and David Rattray at the end of that course engaged him to come and work with us at Fugitives Drift. And he was quite a shy, retiring, reserved young man, and we were trying to encourage him and boost him and develop his confidence, particularly with our older, often well-heeled British clientele. And then, of course, we had the dreadful shock of David Rattray being murdered. And I really needed young Joseph to step into the breach and to assist enormously in terms of the storytelling. And with careful mentoring and encouragement and cajoling and not pushing him any faster than he was prepared to go, we developed in Joseph the most wonderful storyteller. And before long, he was able to host dinners and meals with our British guests and keep them thoroughly entertained with his stories about Zulu culture, his upbringing, his family. And now he, as a retiring shy young student, had almost been brought into the fold of Rattray's storytellers and really was developing a reputation. All his own British people were going back and saying, wow, if you go to Rattray's lodge, you really want to go out in the battlefields with this young, very personable fellow called Joseph Ndima. And then, unfortunately, when I eventually left lodge, the pressures of storytelling without the support, I fear, of myself pushed Joseph into a position where he moved on and joined AMAFA, the Natal Monuments Council, where he now presides over a number of battlefields and takes care of them, of the administration, the protection of those sites and so forth. And as a success story over the last 13 years, when I met Joseph in 2006, all the way up to the end of 2019 and now into 2020, to see the blossoming of this young man and the increase in his confidence and his development as a young leader, and now quite involved with the Monuments Council, presiding over major battlefields in the northern KwaZulu-Natal region, is just the most wonderful success story. And I keep in regular contact with Joseph. He often bounces ideas off me or asks for some advice. And he, to me, is just a wonderful success story. And I'm so pleased that life is now treating him as well as it is.
And Rob, looking back over your career and maybe the course of history, who would you say are the role models of leadership that you would recommend future leaders should study and learn from?
Well, look, Dr. Nick, as I mentioned earlier, I think that leadership has many different forms and many different genres, and human beings today relate to or aspire to different leaders for different reasons. And I think that the sort of leadership that you might find in the Army or the Navy may not necessarily appeal to people who want to be leaders in traditional business today, or, for example, leaders in politics today. I think that the Dalai Lama, in a spiritual sense, has been an incredible leader in very challenging times and given very challenging circumstances. I think that more locally here in South Africa, and you had far more interaction with him than I've had, that the great Nelson Mandela was, for many reasons, considered to be a tremendous leader. And I think then, in a more modern sense today, that this remarkable human being, Imtiaz Suleiman, who is in charge of the gift of the givers, is a man who flies under the radar and certainly is a tremendous example in terms of a leader. Having said all that, I fear that many of the traditional leaders and presidents today are not serving us with a great example of leadership. And as a result, people are moving away from and beginning to draw back from traditional leaderships and presidents of places like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran, more latterly Brazil. I certainly think that there are many who'd be reserved about the leadership we're seeing in the United States, the United Kingdom, parts of Britain, and perhaps even in our own country. But I think that we all, as individuals, need to find leaders who lead in a fashion and a manner that we aspire to and relate to, and then follow those leaders. And that leadership role can be very different for different people.
Now, Rob, how can our listeners connect with you, and where should they follow you?
Dr. Nick, thank you. I have fair activity across a number of social media platforms. I have a personal Facebook page and a professional speaking Facebook page. I certainly am on LinkedIn and Twitter. If anybody can just remember my name and how to spell it, I'm very easy to look up. I have an active website. And then more latterly, I have taken on the challenge of online storytelling. And I'm telling short stories monthly on a platform called Patreon, and trying to get my word out and my purpose out to folks who are willing to lend me an ear. And the response and the enjoyment of the short stories on Patreon has been very, very promising indeed. So really, on any one of those social media platforms, I'm easy to look up, and I would be delighted to interact with listeners who may wish to look me up on any of those platforms.
And tell us, Rob, what are the experiences that our listeners can look forward to that you're going to be offering once we are back to to the next normal? What are the tours you are considering, and what is in the pipeline?
Well, Dr. Nick, I see the future for me with the challenges of COVID-19 being a mixture of live performances and online creations. So I'm certainly still going to be running my tours very actively across the Anglo-Zulu and the Anglo-Boer War battlefields. Folks who join me on those tours find them incredibly memorable experiences, and I think the lessons that come out of those different battles are immense, even in the modern living place. I'm going to continue with my professional speaking career, where I speak at conferences, dinners, seminars, charities and schools here and abroad, particularly in the UK. But I have been lucky enough to speak in the US, in Canada, in Zimbabwe, in Hong Kong, in Bali. And I'm hoping that that repertoire is going to increase once we're allowed to socialize and certainly travel again. And then, of course, in the respective summers, I'll still do my trips on expedition ships to the Arctic and the Antarctic. And although my stories are traditionally historical, I don't like to think of them as being historical narratives and historical stories. I think they are stories about human beings. And I've always tried to extract the human stories in all of these arenas and make them appeal to the listener by connecting with a human being within the story, where you give a human being a personality and a description in terms of his hair color and his eye color and what his favorite meal was and where he grew up and what relationship he had with his mother and his father. And particularly for the ladies who come on our tours or to our talks, it's that human aspect that makes these stories so appealing. And I'm hoping to be able to continue with that. And then, of course, to continue with online presentations via Zoom and other platforms with various companies, and particularly to continue with my interaction on social media with my friends and followers, and to continue telling the stories on Patreon, where the membership has been growing in a very positive manner, and that we remain very positive in a live capacity and certainly in an online capacity post-COVID-19.
And Rob, last but not least, is there one piece of advice that you would like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own leadership, in their own life?
Dr. Nick, if there's one thing that listeners take away from this interview, which I thank you sincerely for, is the fact that success takes time. I was always enormously influenced by Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, where he does a number of case studies and how in the case studies, these groups or individuals had done 10,000 hours before they became the successes that we aspire to and relate to in terms of those stories. So the one piece of advice that I would like to give to listeners is that leadership, success, development as a human being, and in whatever business you're in, takes time. There are very, very few overnight successes. And I would encourage folks to clearly define and identify what they want to do with their lives, what they aspire to being a success of, and then dedicating themselves to that with the clear awareness from the outset that it is going to take time. And you develop in that time the degree of loyalty, authenticity, trust, likability, and so forth that you're wanting to develop in your followers. And in so doing, they will follow you and be led by you on this wondrous journey, which I trust it will become.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership and reminding us that there's no shortcut to success, that it does take time to become a leader, and it does take authenticity and integrity.
Dr. Nick, absolutely. It's always a pleasure dealing with you and speaking with you. Thank you very much for leading this interview as kindly and graciously as you have. And I very much hope that listeners will lend me an ear and find some value in what I've had to say this morning. Thank you very much indeed.